can't be a minister of finance and run away from this thing. You can't run and hide with these things. In 1973, there was a war that was essentially an Arab-Israeli conflict. The outcome of that was an escalation in the price of oil. Prior to that, oil was about $3 a barrel, 3 US. Within a year, oil had gone to $12 US a barrel. Now that's almost 50 years ago. So that caused the price of gasoline and diesel to increase by 400%, 4 times, because it's a direct relationship between the price of oil and the price of gas, gasoline. So oil went from $3 to $12, so the price of gasoline quadrupled. The government at the time, when Eric Williams was Prime Minister, decided that they wanted to subsidize the price of these motor fuels, gasoline and diesel. So they did 2 things. They enacted legislation to create a petroleum subsidy fund, which is funded by a tax on oil producers. So there's a specific pool of money based on the price of oil and the volume of oil produced that creates a fund, petroleum subsidy fund. Together with the money in that fund, the government of the day also put in money from general revenues, from taxpayers' revenues. So the 2 sources of money combined from the petroleum subsidy fund, from the tax and oil companies, and then the government using other taxpayers' money from income tax, corporation tax, etc., were pooled together to subsidize the price of fuel. So the subsidy began in the early 1970s, and it was just a policy decision on the part of the then government to keep the price of fuel down. At this point in time, with oil at its current price, today it's still over $100, $110 I believe, the subsidy would be actually close to $3 billion. The calculations we did recently were at $95, and the subsidy goes up almost exponentially as for every $5 increase in the price of oil, the subsidy goes up almost exponentially. So at a price of $110, the subsidy will be almost $3 billion. Of this, maybe 500 million, 600 million for the most, would be generated by the petroleum subsidy fund. So if, for example, the price of oil remains at $110, then the subsidy will cost $3 billion. And the government will have to put out about $2.5 billion of that from taxpayers' revenues. The ex-refinery price of fuel, gasoline for example, is comprised of the purchase price of the oil, world market price, $110, plus the cost of processing that oil, converting that oil from crude oil into gasoline. And then any company that's doing that will have its overheads and other expenses, transportation costs and so on. So the ex-refinery price is the sum total of the purchase price of the oil at the world price, plus the cost of refining it in the refinery, plus the other overheads that the company would have. That's a set figure. You can go on the internet and you will get the ex-refinery price at all the refineries on the east coast of the United States, for example, which is where we get our gasoline from. So that's the ex-refinery price. When Petrotrin was functioning, it had an ex-refinery price, which would be the price of purchasing the crude and the price of processing the crude. That's the ex-refinery price. Okay. And that is the price that we speak about when we say the correct price for gasoline is $7 or $7.50 or $8, as the case may be. Okay. We buy fuel, whether it's made here or whether it's imported. We buy fuel, and that fuel is distributed to motorists. So when there was a refinery, the refinery would produce gasoline and diesel, sell it to NP. This is before Unipet came into play. And NP is a wholesaler and also has its own outlet, so it would be a retailer as well. And as a wholesaler, NP would then sell that gasoline and diesel to petroleum dealers, who would then sell it in their gas stations at a fixed price. The price is set by the government based on a formula in one of the petroleum laws. So from 1974 to now, successive governments have adjusted the price of gasoline and diesel and kerosene sold to motorists at gas stations based on ability to subsidize and based on policy considerations. We use about 1 billion liters of fuel in Trinidad and Tobago every year. And the average cost of that fuel at $95 is about $7 TT per liter. As you go up the chain and you get to 110, it might be $8 or more. That would be the average cost of diesel and gasoline. Now, we also, in Trinidad and Tobago, the population is not properly aware of the real cost of premium gasoline, super gasoline, or what is called regular gasoline in the United States, and diesel. In Europe, for example, diesel costs more than gasoline, believe it or not. So if you check the price of diesel now in Italy, Germany, those countries, you will see the cost of auto diesel is more than gasoline. With respect to gasoline itself, there isn't much of a differential between premium gas, high octane gas, and regular gasoline. If you look in the States, you're talking about a couple cents is the difference. So at this point in time, with oil at $95, or if you use an average price of $95, because oil is in fact at 110, the cost of premium gasoline would be over $7, maybe $7.25. The cost of super would also be over $7, might be $7.05. And the cost of diesel would be about $6.50, $6.70 at this point in time, because we get our fuel from the United States. If we were getting our fuel from elsewhere, diesel might be even more than the two gasolines. So let's say the average is $8. At $110 is the price of oil. The average price of fuel, whether it's diesel or gasoline, would be $8 TT a liter. With our annual consumption of $1 billion, that means the country, the government, has to pay $8 billion to purchase fuel for the population. At the prices prior to today, the new prices went into effect today, but last week, for example, the revenue that would have been generated from that $8 billion expenditure would have been $5. So the remainder that has to be made up by the government and by the Petroleum Subsidy Fund would be $3 billion. That's how you arrive at the 3. So we would be paying $8 billion for fuel and selling it for $5. And somebody has to pay that extra $3 billion. And the bulk of it has to come from the treasury, and that's from value-added tax, personal income tax, corporation tax, customs duty, all the revenue sources that the government has. That is where that $3 billion has to come from. So it's an expense. The $3 billion is an additional expense. Now, at the beginning of this year, we had set the budget at an oil price of $65. And at that price, the subsidy that the government would have to pay was about $200 million. It was a small amount. In fact, at $60, there would have been a break-even. Now oil is 110, 100, that sort of thing. So that the subsidy that has to be paid to maintain prices at the current level is an expense that was not budgeted for in the national budget. That is something people need to understand, because there's a lot of misinformation that, we allocated for the subsidy in the national budget, and therefore what are we quarreling about? It is not true. We allocated $200 million for the subsidy, not $2 billion, which is what it really is, $2 billion plus. So we produce oil in Trinidad. We don't produce fuel. When we had a functioning refinery, we produced fuel. But that did not help us one bit, because the same equation I just gave you, if you have to purchase the fuel from the refinery for $8 billion and sell it to the consumer at $5 billion, you still have to make up that shortfall of 3 billion. Now, back in 2014, the fuel consumption was even higher than it is now. Now we're burning up 1 billion liters of fuel. In those days, they were burning up 1.3 billion liters of fuel, 30% more. And oil was going all the way up to $130, $140. The fuel subsidy in 1 year alone, I think it was 2014, was $7 billion. 7,000 million. So can you imagine if the government at the time, I said, all right, we will put aside 2 billion, because they were flush with money in those days, and that's not this government, that's the one before. If they had said, all right, let's put aside 2 billion, use that to keep the price of fuel down, and take out the other 5 billion and spend it productively. Spending it, as I said, fixing our infrastructure, helping people, social grants, etc. They chose not to do that. They were afraid. They were afraid of the backlash from the population, so they felt, look, they wouldn't do it. But it was a very bad decision. Because can you imagine if they had that 5 billion? They could have paid all the back pay to public servants, for example, and not leave it for an incoming government to deal with as an expense to burden the treasury. So there are many different things that the money could be better used for, and we think it's just not a good allocation of resources. Okay, but the fact that the refinery is not operational at this time makes no difference, because the price of the fuel would have been the same. And in the case of that refinery, it was even worse, because we don't produce enough oil in Trinidad to put the throughput through the refinery to make it efficient. A refinery needs to have a certain volume of oil processed on a daily basis. Our refinery needs about 140,000 barrels of oil being processed every day. Otherwise, it's not being used efficiently. And what was happening in the past is that the refinery, Petrotrin, would purchase 100,000 barrels of oil every single day, because we produce about 30 or 40,000, or they produced, Petrotrin produced 30 or 40,000 barrels of oil, and they had to supplement that with importing 100,000 barrels of oil every single day. So the amount of oil going through the refinery was 4 times what Petrotrin was capable of producing from its oil fields, whether land or offshore. That 100,000 barrels a day in today's world, at today's oil prices, would cost Petrotrin $10 million a day, every single day. So take 10 million and multiply it by 365, and you will see what we're talking about. You're talking about 3.6 billion US. The refinery would have to spend in a year to just process oil at a point where the machinery and the equipment in the refinery was efficient. What was worse was that the way the refinery operations were structured, the refinery was overstaffed, so that on every single barrel of oil that they processed, including the 100,000 that they bought every day, they lost $8. Okay? A lot of that information is bad information for starters. Before I get to the principle and the policy, a lot of the information is bad. Let's take Barbados, for example. The cost of living is higher than Trinidad, and the price of fuel is higher as well in Barbados. It's a false comparison, because what it does, it avoids the reality of having to pay $7 or $8 billion for fuel and then sell it back for $5 billion. And you have a $2 billion or $3 billion deficit to make up. What those groups are in fact saying is, forget the economics. Forget the fact that you're paying $7 or $8 billion for this product, and then you sell it at 5, and you have to make up a loss of 2 or 3 billion. Ignore that and just keep the price down because of these false comparisons with cost of living and wages and so on. If you take the United States, for example, the cost of living in the United States is so much more than Trinidad. The price of fuel is also so much more. So these are false equivalencies and false comparisons, but forget the numbers. Let's take Guyana, for example. The cost of gasoline in Guyana is over $7. As we speak here today, it's $1.07 US, I believe, is what the price of gasoline is in Guyana. And That is $7.25 TT a liter. But the wages in Guyana, 1/3 or less of Trinidad and Tobago. So it's a country that the commentators are avoiding. It's right in front of them. It's an oil producing country. Wages are a fraction of what they are in Trinidad. And yet the fuel is more expensive in Guyana than in Trinidad and Tobago. But the whole point of it, all these things are not really relevant. Because what is relevant is where are you finding the $2 or $3 billion from to make up the difference between the cost of purchasing the fuel and the price at which you're selling the fuel. And none of the commentators are saying where they're getting that from. Are they going to increase value added tax, for example? Where's the money going to come from? Are they going to increase your income tax rate? Are they going to reduce the personal allowance? Are they going to increase duties on imported goods? Where are they getting the $2 or $3 billion from? They have avoided that question because they don't want to treat with it. They don't want to treat with the reality that there is a $2 or $3 billion deficit that has to be made up from somewhere. So that a lot of the commentary, I would say all of it, is completely off point. They're not dealing with the reality that this is an expense and money has to be found to deal with this expense. And if you have to find that amount of money, 2 or 3 billion, is this the best use for it? So their points really are not relevant. So that we as a government and a country have to make a decision. If you have $2 billion to spend, and it's not budgeted, it's an unplanned, unforeseen expense, what do you spend it on? Do you spend it on keeping the price of gasoline and diesel down? Or do you take it and use it to build schools, to fix roads, to pay bills for suppliers, for the social safety net, for social grants and so on? What do you spend this money on? Do you use it to spend it to assist the police in the fight against crime? What? And we don't think it's a good use of resources to take $2 billion or $3 billion for that matter, if prices stay up above $100, and spend it on this. We feel that you could subsidize part of it, so there's not too much of a shock on the system. But we also feel that we should take some of the expenditure and apply it to other things on the development program, as I told you, on patching potholes, on fixing roads, on cleaning drains, on making sure that we avoid any flooding that might come in the oncoming rainy season, on the health sector, on, free medication, CDAP, on tertiary education, on free university education. We feel it's far better to take that money and spend it. Now, that is not money that is just dropping out of the sky. It's an expense. So we don't think it's a good idea to take $2 or $3 billion and spend it on this. If we have $2 or $3 billion, it should be spent on something else that is of much greater benefit to the population. You have to go to electric cars. Now, the problem with the electric car, the electricity itself costs money, but you have no pollution, and then the cost of electricity to run an electric car is a fraction of what the cost of gasoline or diesel is. So that is the future, to reduce the price on the road of a hybrid vehicle by reducing the taxes, because the taxes make up maybe 30% or more of the cost of one of these vehicles. So let's say your typical vehicle is $200,000 or $220,000, brand new. You might find of that $60,000 or $70,000 or more would be taxes. So that we took a decision to remove the taxes on appropriately sized hybrid vehicles, small ones, because you want to push people towards fuel economy. So you want to push them towards vehicles that would give you mileage of, if I use the old system, 60 miles per gallon. Now, a typical car might give you 20 miles per gallon, 25 miles per gallon if you're lucky. So you want to push people towards hybrids, small engine hybrids that could get you up to 60 miles per gallon. So they will burn half the fuel of a conventional vehicle. But even that doesn't put a dent in the subsidy, Seriously. Because let's say the typical amount of tax you might forego on a small hybrid would be $50,000. If you bring in 2,000 of those, that's $100 million in revenue that you're foregoing, that the government is giving up. When you look at the amount of fuel that 2,000 hybrids would burn, you're saving maybe $2 million. My job is to present to the rest of the government and the cabinet the facts that, look, we have to find $2 or $3 billion this year to subsidize fuel. What should we do? Should we take that money away from other areas? Because that money has to come from somewhere. Because you're not producing money, you're not growing money on a tree. So if you have to find $2 billion, you have to take it from the health sector, or you have to take it from the university, or you have to stop fixing roads, or you have to cancel free medication in the CDAP, and so on. So this, I as Minister of Finance, I have to present this to the cabinet to say, here's an extra $2 billion we have to spend. We didn't plan for this. What is the best use of this money? And the cabinet will decide, yes or no. Okay, let's go ahead and spend the $2 billion on subsidizing fuel, or no, let's spend $1 billion, which is more or less what we have done at this point in time. And the other $1 billion, let's use it for more productive areas, such as fixing roads and providing free medication and so. So as Minister of Finance, it's my job to make the recommendations and to advise the cabinet on what is the best use of the fuel. It's nobody else's job, and I can't run from it. It's not the nicest job in the world, but I take my job very, very seriously. You know, there are things you have to do that are not pleasant, but if you don't do them, the consequences will be worse.